Hello, thank you everyone for having me. So my project is called Ways of Making, and my project is kind of all about craftsmanship and making, with the aim of creating an architecture that expresses the mark of the hand. Next slide, please. So these pages that you'll see were kind of taken out of a book by British architect Thomas Heatherwick, capturing buildings from all around the world. Next slide, please. This project was birthed out of almost a discontent with the materials I've found have been used in architecture. Next. Walking around the city, I found that buildings have become textureless. Next. I'm sure many of these images even look similar to places within your own cities. Next. I found that the mark of the maker, this mark of the hand, has been removed from architecture, especially the architecture we encounter day to day. Next, please. Throughout history, architects, they've always wavered in involvement with construction. But nowadays, it's actually quite hard to find an architect that has this deep personal knowledge of material. Next. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, this idea or this role of the master craftsman, they combined the roles of builder, craftsman, engineer, and designer. So this way, the generation of ideas was heavily connected to the process of turning them into reality. Next. So due to industrial development, designers over time became disconnected from materials. And this industrial revolution began to replace man with man-made machines. Next. Architecture was even more disconnected from craft when computer modeling became more accessible. Architects and designers resigned to the screen and therefore created this disconnect between architecture and the raw materials from which it is built. Next. A chef will cook the recipe they crafted, a mathematician will solve the equation they posed, a musician will play the symphony they wrote. Next, please. But an architect will draw a building and will hand it over for someone else to make. Next. And I found that this helps to explain why much of the new architecture I see around me almost feels sterile and lacking in material expression. Next. So my aim for this project was to return to physical craft and making. Material isn't just something that is put on a building, but it's the very thing from which it is made. Next. So what I did was made everything by hand. Even all the drawings, everything I did for this whole project was by hand. And I really placed material at the genesis of the design process, using the intrinsic qualities present in the material to create an architecture that honestly represents craft and reveals the mark of its maker. Next. So I used the workshop as my main source of developing design ideas. Dutch architect Anne Holtrop, he talks about this thing called material gesture, where the materiality and the gesture that is already bound to the material as being something to work with, as something that can define architecture and can define the design. Next. By tying design to the process of making and building, the design becomes self-evident. So starting with material gestures in the design process can lead to initial ideas and forms that might be outside of the realm of architecture to start off with, but then developing them to perform as architecture. In this way, architecture emerges from a process-driven approach. Next. Most of the time, I don't even know what I'll come up with. I just go down to the workshop, and depending on how much material I have, using offcuts and scrap pieces to add this element of constraint to push these ideas. Next. And each piece I made can become an idea for an architectural project. I make them with the thought of how they might translate to the scale of a building. Next. Thinking about how even a curve or a joint or a texture can become an architectural element. Next. So one thing I found really interesting or discovered was this process of hydroforming. And this is where you basically inflate steel using water, using just like a little water blaster. where the compressive strength of water is stronger than the tensional strength of steel. And this allows for almost a release and control of what the final form of steel will take. This hydroforming has the ability to make one of the most rigid and brutal building materials look soft like fabric. This warping of the material, it almost unlocks a strength and solidity in the steel. This multi-directional curve that's kind of being forced into the material using high pressure allows for a new shape to be held. So yeah, the steel really was flat and then kind of just inflates like a pillow, as you can see in the white background image. Next, please. Another material I also heavily explored was clay and ceramics. I found that when you hold a ceramic, you can really understand it and anticipate the process that saw it made and the quality of the material. I found that this tangibility, it could be read. Next. So I created, next please. So I created these tile inlay wall prototypes where I took these handmade tiles and I cast them into concrete to almost create, a wall prototype on how one could experience this materiality one-to-one at a one-to-one scale within a building. Next. And then also explored with more furniture making by creating tile furniture, kind of merging experiments in both steel and clay together at a one-to-one scale. Next. So this is my site, Newtown, Wellington, in the city that I live. Next. So it's quite a dynamic neighborhood. A lot of social housing, a lot of different ethnicities come together in this space. And I really wanted to create a community space that acknowledges the cultural background of the daily lives and practices of the people who use the space. In dealing with this laneway that my site is on, I found that it's not enough to just put a building there and expect people to go to the site. To propose a site focusing on a laneway and to only think of housing or only think of a community space would ignore the culture and context of Newtown and what it takes to bring people in from the main streets. Next. So I decided to create a community building and some form of housing across the laneway as well, and hospitality. Next, please. And from there, more formal explorations are developed solely using material as a design driver. Next. Previous investigations with this knowledge that I have developed, crafting using steel and clay, timber and fabric, is all deployed into an architectural inquiry where the act of making and material gesture converge at an architectural scale. Next. So my challenge was to almost bridge this gap from the furniture scale that I was able to explore with to a much larger architectural scale, all while preserving the materiality explored. Next. In order to engage a neighborhood and create a space that doesn't just become empty or sterile to a community, my program that I decided for the building has veered towards a ceramic studio and gallery open to the street. This architecture is becoming in service of craftsmanship. Next, please. The question I posed at the beginning of this project was asking how the inherent qualities in a material can be used to produce architecture. And my realization now has been to learn and understand materials, all done through this act of making, where craft becomes intrinsically linked to the material. Next. So this is my final design. I went through a process of iterating through materials, whether to use tension fabric or timber or steel. Yes, but the materials here for the facade and within the final architecture all reflect similar qualities. Steel sheet will patina over time, and ceramic tiles also hold this record of process. Next. Next, thank you. Yes, so the scale and pattern of each aspect were chosen to reflect the art of the art of the hand. These operable hydroformed steel sheet panels that kind of line the edge of the building. They all face the main street. Next. These hydroformed steel panels, they act as a facade, curving outwards in contrast to the building's overall form curving inwards. Next. They provide some seclusion from the street edge, and these operable panels act to shade the building, allowing for a cool environment to work with wet clay, creating almost a passive ventilation system. Next. So you can see here a little scale mock-up of the hydroform panels and also a little detail to show how you can kind of pull them open and close at 90 degrees so the building can completely open up or be completely closed. Next, please. Yes. So here you can see, oh, we can go, thank you. So here you can see the building also has this hydroform core in the middle, which really acts to use material explorations that I have developed to actually hold the building up as well, tying structure and form together. So I really discovered quite a bit of strength with the dual curve used in the hydroform, and yeah, chose to use this as the core structure for the building. Next. And next. So users of the ceramic studio, they become makers of the space. From pulling panels open and closed to shifting shelves, the environment is constantly changed and crafted by the users. The discovery of the hydroform technique and the building of tile inset wall prototypes were both inquiries aimed at merging form, material, and structure together, where the formal qualities of steel and clay act to hold the building up. This hydroform core centered in the ceramic studio creates unity of design intent and structure instead of just ornamentation. Next. So throughout this whole making process, I really realized how impatient I was. I found myself craving shortcuts and started to see why handcraft has become suppressed due to the cost of labor, the time taken, and the risk of mistake and imperfection. Throughout this project, I realized that my qualm is not actually with the machine-made object, but rather with material knowledge and craft being removed and separated from the process of design. When we make objects with our hands, we utilize the knowledge we have on material in order to design. But with reliance on the machine, and this hand being removed from the process of making, therefore, by the default, the knowledge library and material contained within a craftsman's hands becomes second to that of the machine. Next. Multidisciplinary workshops throughout history, such as the Bauhaus School, they were actually all designing with the goal of mass manufacture. However, with this physical notion of craft and making, it was never removed from the design process. In the early stages of design, these workshops were all prototyping, perfecting, and making their designs by hand in their workshops. When design processes are linked to craftsmanship, the output forms a dialogue with its maker. So my concluding thoughts place a boundary on mass manufactured design and the machine. All these forms of outworking can be successfully used in the conception of architecture, but architecture ought to observe the iterative and the circular experiments done through physical material outworkings in the conceptual design process. And this comes down to the architect. This was all a project to help my own knowledge in craft. If the architect is going to work with materials, then the architect must know the language a material speaks. While an architect might not build a building like a musician builds music or like a chef builds a dish, they're able to engage with craft and the conversation of material, which will ultimately be shown in the built outcome. Thank you.